Before we start this video, I just want to let you guys know that I have a Patreon now. It helped considering I don't get monetization from my videos yet, so it helped nicely. Also, this versus video is heavily inspired on Eric Carter's videos. Make sure you guys subscribe to him. I'll link him down below. I'll also say that this video only has the context of the first season of Songs of War only. That way we can make it more balanced and fair to the other movie. Now, without further ado, let's get started on our video. 2020's full movie for Songs of War I thought was one of the best animated movies I've seen in a while. However, that while was when I watched The Last Guest for the first time, my #1 favorite Roblox movie, and is definitely on my top 10 list of favorite animated movies. But which of the two movies was better? Let the battle commence. Now, what's really interesting about both movies is that the story is divided into multiple story arcs, and they utilize these arcs very effectively, especially in The Last Guest's shorter runtime of 1 hour and 30 minutes, compared to Songs of War's way higher 2 hour and 12 minute runtime. With Songs of War, there are only 3 story arcs, whereas with The Last Guest, there are only 2. But those 2 carry more weight in the smaller runtime of The Last Guest than the 3 in Songs of War. Anyways, the main plot for Songs of War is that years after the Great War, the Voltars are threatening to return to the world of Ardonia, and only Thalius is preparing for an attack. So he brings the clanless Sen on his journey, who gets a much different adventure than he could ever imagine. Meanwhile, 2 thieves, Jalkar and Grim, have stolen the Ender Dragon egg from a place called Etheria. Abigail, a nearby farmer, tracks down and hunts these 2 thieves. And in the force of the Kingdom of Felden, a guy named Lucan investigates a necromancer army with the help of an unexpected ally, Nika, as they fight zombies and the other undead. Moving on, the story of The Last Guest revolves around a character who goes by the name of Guest 1337, or just Guest in the story. We see as he grows, he's learning to adapt the way who he is. However, at a playground, his parents were killed by a bacon hare. So he's taken to an orphanage where he is met by 2 other people, Matt and Daisy. They grow up with Daisy and Guest being married, and as time goes on, Guest becomes worried about the Bacon Hare Empire and that he'll join the army to stop them whatsoever. So he does, and then sacrifices himself and is then presumed dead. In the other arc of Last Guest, we have a bacon hare named Jez, who lost his mother at a young age. We then begin to see he is training to serve for the Bacon Empire, but as time goes on, he learns that the colonel and his father, or the general, are lying to him, and that the Bacons are the actual villains. Now, I won't go deeper into the story of both movies, as they are deeply focused and detailed, and goes on a long but fast pace. And that's another strength both movies have. They tell their stories with incredible pacing. It doesn't feel too slow or too rushed, and the story feels fleshed out. And that's such a miracle for The Last Guest for its very short runtime of just 90 minutes. However, some parts still seem rushed, especially during part 3, The Uprising, and most of the story was visualized in a montage. But they made the visual storytelling more heartwarming and beautiful, not cheesy like we see in some Hollywood movies. Songs of War did make use of its 132-minute runtime, but some of this stuff seemed unnecessary and were only used for long exposition. That being said, the prologue for this movie was done very well through visual and narrative storytelling, and I was full on board with this journey. So, which movie has the superior story? Well, I was originally going to give it to Songs of War due to its better pacing and runtime to make the story more fleshed out. But at the same time, there were some moments that suddenly became slow, and some scenes were kind of unnecessary. Therefore, I'd say The Last Guest. In a short 90-minute runtime, it managed to have 2 arcs develop, make those arcs merge, and end them in a satisfying conclusion. Most of what Songs of War did was fine and was actually necessary to the plot, But like I said, some other stuff did not seem relevant at all, although Songs of War still has the runtime and pacing to its advantage. So the movie with the slightly superior story is The Last Guest. Now both movies have a large cast of characters, so I'll just go off on their main characters. So our first arc for Songs of War, nicknamed the Ardoni arc, we get Thalius, played by Carl G. Brooks, and Sen, played by Tom Aglio. The two interacting with each other was very naturally played, and it genuinely seemed like they were having a natural conversation.
We are cleared for travel to Crown Peak.
Wait, so we're traveling further? We must be at the end of the world by now.
Sen, we have barely crossed a fifth of Ardonia. We've not even left the north.
Also, the Ardoni species themselves were very interesting. They can wield and harness special powers known as songs, and the way they showcased this I thought was ingenious, but we'll get to that in the action segment. Our second arc, nicknamed the Felden arc, revolves around three characters. Lucan, played by Stephen J. Pena, Nika, played by Allison Sales, and Kiyoshi, played by Garrett. Those three, or two actually, specifically Lucan and Nika, since they get more scenes together, are like Thalius and Sen. They make great interactions with each other, and the comedy they exchange is also quite funny as well, and not cheap and childish like the MCU.
Have orders to deliver a message to Fort Zuka.
They actually said for both of us?
Yep. Looks like we're stuck together for just a bit longer.
Our third and final arc, dubbed the Ender arc, only has one main character, whose name is Abigail, played by Elisa Wu. And I'll be honest, out of the three arcs, the Ender arc is the least interesting and most boring. Now the interactions and dialogue are fine, but I found this arc to be really slow and sometimes uninteresting. With that said, all of these characters are great, and the actors are performing very well in their respective roles. And what works to their advantage again is the story structure, runtime, and pacing. So it makes them all fleshed out. And that's another thing, none of these characters are just there for exposition. They have a clear purpose on their journey, and when they inevitably cross over in parts 2 and 3, it'll all be worth it. As for the characters in The Last Guest, there's still a large quantity of characters. However, our main characters are just relegated to 4. Guest, Matt, Daisy, and Jez. The 4 have fun interactions, especially in their montages. However, there's still this sad feel to Guest. You feel that he's a very nice guy, trapped in a tragic situation. I got that from Eric Carter, by the way. Now, Jez is pretty much the main kick-ass badass of the movie. I mean, really, he knows how to fight. He beat up an entire ring of people, for crying out loud. But I never felt a good emotional connection with some of these characters. The only good connection I did have was with Guest and the tragedies he had to go through, and Jez, for he also suffered multiple tragedies throughout the movie, from beginning to end. With Songs of War, everyone is made important to the story and plot, and everyone is made to have connections to other people. And these people don't just spit out exposition throughout the majority of the runtime. Some minor characters do that, but in terms of our main characters, they all have something important to contribute. As opposed to The Last Guest, for which only 2 of our main characters are actually good and heartwarming enough for the audience to feel more for them. So the movie with the superior characters is Songs of War. Although The Last Guest was still far more effective in visually telling their stories. So even if you don't care for them very much, you still have a sense of happiness with them, and dread when they are being stalked by the villains. Speaking of which, this is where it leads to our next section. Songs of War's primary villains are the Voltaris, and they are pretty good as the primary villains. The prologue states their history and motivations, and they feel like real people, and their actions really show just how threatening they are. And the Voltaris do a ton of stuff that actually makes them threatening. And it's a lot more than just killing people. No, they burn the homeland of Thalius and Sen. And after that, one of the members actually killed Thalius. There was just one problem that put off guard for them. In the burning Sandaria scene, the current leader of the Voltaris, that being Tigran Voltaris, starts to monologue about the Prime songs and how Thalius is going to die, which he does. All the while, the rest of the Voltars are just standing there doing nothing. And this was more of a minor nitpick, but it was still sticking out there like a bumpy thumb. We also have secondary villains of the Necromancers who want to use the undead to take over a part of Ardonia, and Jalkar, played by Quinn O'Quinn, who just wants to sell an Ender Dragon egg for money. But that's about it. I mean, it did seem generic the way I explained it, but as you'll see in the movie, they're still quite decent and threatening as secondary villains. Now, the movie has spent a great time in the Ardonia arc building up the Death Singer. We see him in flashbacks in the prologues and get clues as to where he is going to emerge, but up until this point, we still haven't seen him in his full glory. It isn't until the portal collapses open that we see him in his full glory fighting the Tide Singer, another protagonist in the story. And the music that played also sold you on this tension and feeling of dread. And this reveal was masterful and so awesome. Now as for the villains in The Last Guest, they're essentially on the same level as Songs of War. The Colonel and General of the Bacons have solid history, solid motivations, and great dialogue. And what they do is absolutely immoral and makes you damn right to despise them. They enslave the guests and leave them to the brink of extinction. And this is very evident in the guest games.
There is now only one last guest remaining in Roblox, and we will stop at nothing until we take him down. It is time to cleanse ourselves of more pathetic guests!
And the music also sells you on this feeling of dread as they fight in the guest games. So, which movie has the better villains? Well, I'd say Songs of War. The Voltaris had solid motivations, the secondary villains are decent, and the build up to the Death Singer was amazing. The Last Guest also had good villains, but overall, Songs of War wins this category. I'll start this category with the animation for The Last Guest. Now I will say that The Last Guest animation was decent enough for what it was, but it didn't have much variety for me. It was simple, basic, but lacked much creativity at all. Some shots were great, and much of the cinematography was also great, but at times it looked less creative and really jarring. The animation for Songs of War, however, is a massive jackpot. Songs of War uses Blender, so it can really help to make variety in facial expressions, and that being one of its massive strengths, makes their emoting and expression more natural than the face changer mode for The Last Guest. And the lighting and the cinematography 99% of the time was creative and beautiful. I get that Matt didn't have much of a choice, but still, Songs of War, without a shadow of a doubt, has the better animation. Now the action for The Last Guest was just decent, and that was pretty much it. It included a lot of physical combat and martial arts, but sometimes the action felt a bit generic and boring. The guest games, despite having weight and tension, didn't have that good of choreography. It was still fine for what it was, but it could have been more brutal with the more severe action they go through. Also, that final group battle was just an embarrassment. It's basically a copy-paste of fighting animation. It looks like a dance party. Now the solo fights were good, but I still have many problems with them. There were some slow-mo incorporated, and I felt like some of it was kind of unnecessary. Some of the fight choreography was good, but at other times, some of it felt kind of lame. Also, I wish the fights had more variety at their disposal, not just flip kicks and punching. Not to mention, the transitioning felt kind of rushed, and there was something wrong with the lighting at times. Still, they were good fights for what they were. Now, let me say this again. Songs of War's action is made by Blender. It's essentially an animation software where you can basically make an animation with full creativity in your hands, and the production team and the special effects team took full advantage of that. I don't know how else to put it. When the Ardoni fight, their fights with songs look like they were taken straight out of a comic book. And when they use traditional weapon clashing like swords and axes and such, that too was awesome, and it creatively showed how these people can just kill each other. Also, when I first watched this movie, I thought the songs the Ardoni wield would just be MacGuffins, but turns out they were more balanced than expected, and that all comes down to David Arbiter's directorial style. He likes very fast-paced and well-choreographed battles, with everything being equal and mostly evenly matched. And it is also held that the fight animators, Skyfall and Zillion, spend their time and effort into making these fights. And most of these fights were flawless, fast, spectacular, and epic. Like, if you need to think about the action in both movies, then rewind this section of the video to watch the action scenes, because it is quite obvious which movie comes out on top. Songs of War, without a shadow of a doubt, wins this category. Now, based on my attitude for The Last Guest, it seems like I'm not that fond of it, but I actually am. It was actually one of my favorite childhood movies, and still holds up to one of my top 10 favorite animated movies. In fact, at the end of the video, stay tuned for I'll list those top 10 animated movies. But that being said, The Last Guest hasn't aged that well as I've grown older to understand, whereas Songs of War just keeps on being better over time. It's time for the scores. The Last Guest gets a strong 7 out of 10, and Songs of War gets a 9. This was not an easy battle, as I adored both movies and grew up with them. That being said, Last Guest, as I look at it now, is not as great as I thought it'd be upon rewatching it, but still holds up to me today. But yeah, Songs of War holds its candle up as the superior movie, and I can't wait for the KOA animation group and Helio's animation community to release Season 2, Episode 1. Okay, so thank you for watching this video. If you can support me on Patreon, that would be nice, as you can get early access to my videos and a higher chance to have your video ideas chosen for one of my upcoming videos. Anyways, top 10 animated movies, or favorite animated movies. Number 10 is The Bacon Hair, also directed by Matt, Oblivious. 9 is WALL-E. 8th is The Last Guest. 7 is both Frozen 1 and 2. 6 is Finding Nemo and Dory. 5 is Mulan. 4 is The Incredibles. 3 is Songs of War. Yeah, The Last Guest didn't have much of a chance. 2 is all 4 Toy Story movies. And my absolute number 1 favorite is Lion King. So that was my list. I know some movies were compacted into group, but some were paralleled in level, so I kind of had to stack them. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.